Hello everyone. This is the seventh part of the story, Abe the Wizard. Chapter 34, Compound Bow. With the free time that he had, Abel decided to use it for some power-up first. By power-up, he would like to start with his weapons. Thinking back to his encounter with the war gen, he did remember himself wanting some sort of long-range weapon in his hands. Even if he couldn't make the right aim, he could have at least slowed it down. Abel had spent a great deal of his time thinking about making projectile weapons. He did do his research on the kind of bows that were produced in this world, but his main interest lied in something a little different. He wanted to craft a 70-pound compound bow, the same one he had used during his time on Earth. The greatest thing about compound bows was how energy efficient they were. To put it mathematically, if you were to save up 80% of your total strength, you would only need about 14 pounds of force to hold the string while it was being pulled. Conveniently enough, all that remaining strength would be used for improving accuracy and adjusting the wielder's postures. If you were to save up 60% of your total strength, you would need about 28 pounds of force to keep the bow in its fully pulled state. When you do, the shot would be a lot faster and much stronger. With the blessing of the power of the will on his side, Abel could recall memories with an extraordinary level of detail. That being, he had a very clear memory of what a compound bow should be like. He knew what parts were essential to make one, and he knew all the sizes of these parts. Let's see. Idler wheel, cam, upper and lower limb, grip, arrow rest, string slider, string stabilizer, handle, bus cable, limb pocket, string silencer, and cam. Apart from the main parts, there were also parts such as an attachable arrow rest, sight, release aid, a stick for reducing vibration, a peeping hole, and a wrist rope. That's pretty much all the parts of a complete set of a modern compound bow. While this world was not blessed with technology, the people living in it were much stronger than the people on Earth. It wasn't hard to figure that out. As far as Abel knew, he's never heard of someone slicing a human and a horse in half with just one swing of a word. And remember, the Knight of Martial was an intermediate knight. As insane as his achievement, there was no telling what people stronger than he could do. If anything, Abel was already stronger than most people on Earth. At a ridiculously young age of 13, he was able to release a total of 400 pounds of force with just his raw strength. During his time on Earth as a bodybuilding trainer, the tightest bow he could pull was only about 70 pounds in total. While it was impossible to find the same raw ingredients here as one would on Earth, Abel was free to craft the bow in however ways he desired. That being said, he could use some very sturdy materials with little to no regard for the resulting weight of the bow. He was a strong kid, and everyone was pretty strong in this world. Having made a list of the things he needed to make, Abel started drawing sketches on multiple pieces of paper. When he was done, he would label the size of these parts and think about the sort of materials he would need for them. For the idler wheel and the power wheel, Abel thought that he would use one bearing to support both of their rotating motion. There were a couple of reasons to do this. Reducing friction. Improving the accuracy of the spin. While it was a crucial part of the bow, he would have to make the two wheels by treating them for 100 times. Because of how much time the upper and the lower limbs would take, Abel decided that he wasn't going to make them himself. So how was he going to get them? Simple. He would go to the storage room and take them out of two heavy bows. There were a few 200-pound bows in the storage room. While they were the finest bows in Harry Castle, almost nobody in the castle could use them properly. For starters, one would at least have to be above being a rank 4 novice to pull the bow's string. And even if one could manage to do that, he would have to use the same amount of force to aim at his target. In this sense, you would, technically, need about 300 pounds of force if you want to use the bow properly. If Abel could get his hands on these heavy bows, he would have himself a bow limb and 2 extra strings. He was going to make a massive limb for his new bow, which would use up to 2 whole limbs of a heavy bow for its upper and lower limb. For the stabilizers, Abel would use the same timber as the ones he could take apart from these heavy bows. For the handle and the arrow rest, he would make from bases of 100 skills. Abel commenced his work after he did all of his blueprints. Having taken 2 heavy bows out of the storage room, he found himself a bow maker to help him make the compound bow. While he was not very confident in his bow limb, he decided to have a professional checking it for him. The bow maker, being a professional in his area, had a sad, "What a waste this is" look on his face when he took apart the 2 heavy bows. He cut the wood into the sizes that Abel had drawn on paper and glued the limbs together with some fish gel. Abel was very pleased with the resulting product. For the stabilizers, Abel found himself a carpenter, who followed his instructions and made the parts as requested. After every other part was done, it was now Abel's turn to make his bearing. While it was not known to many people, the bearing was the most important part of every machinery on Earth. A bearing would consist of 3 parts, the inner race, the outer race, and about several balls that would roll around the space between the inner and the outer race. As difficult as it was to make bearings, they were mostly made in factories by mechanical beds. Abel didn't have access to a mechanical bed, of course. He would have to rely on himself only, which, even for a master blacksmith like him, was not an easy job to do. Abel started with the balls. He made himself a vernier scale, and after hitting small pieces of iron into little spheres, he would use it to make sure that he's got the exact measurement that he wanted. It was a very, very exhausting process. For a single small ball, it would take him about several hours to make. After making his first ball, Abel used some clays and water to build himself a molding model. It was kind of like the wet sand casting process, which was used to replicate pieces of metal from liquid form. By making 1 ball with his hands, Abel was able to make 30 copies of it with just his clay mold. While only 12 balls were needed for 1 bearing, Abel decided to make some spares in case he needed them. With that mind, he got himself some iron so he could melt them for casting. He had expected this to be the most annoying process, mainly because he would have to use charcoals to slowly liquefy the metal pieces. Luckily, Master Bentham gave him this ointment for raising a fire's heat. With just a few drops into the flame, the metal pieces started melting in a very short time. Abel poured the liquid iron into 30 of his clay mold. Once they had all cooled down, Abel took them and filed the edges for a bit. Once he was done, he's got himself 30 perfect small iron balls. Next up, Abel had to combine the inner and outer race with the iron balls. Whilst looking back to the many physics lectures and documentaries he had watched in the past, he got out some pieces of ice and stuffed them into the inner race. He took the outer race and put it inside the stove. That's right, he was using the thermal expansion and thermal contraction to combine the 3 parts in order. After he was done making his bearing, Abel made his idler wheel and power wheel and attached them all. Soon, he's got himself the first compound bow of the history of this world. Realizing how late it was, Abel hid away the compound bow and went back home. The next morning, after playing with Black Wind for a while, Abel went for some testing in the shooting. He got himself 50 arrows with the intention of shooting them all in one practice. Abel took out his first arrow, placed it on the arrow rest and pulled on his release aid. Unlike what he had imagined, the tightness of the string was unlike anything he saw before. With the combined power of 2 heavy bows, the compound bow would take more than 400 pounds of force to be pulled. As hard as it was for Abel to pull on the string, it was a lot easier for him to hold it after he did. That's the beautiful thing about a compound bow. Once having pulled it apart, you wouldn't even 100 pound of force to keep the arrow in release mode. Abel aimed towards his target, which was about 50 meters away from where he was standing. With a light press of the trigger on his release aid, the arrow was fired away at a pace that was not visible. It shot right through the center of the target and continued to fly for 30 meters more into the back wall before it finally stopped. Damn! This shooting range was already the longest one in the entire Harry Castle. Abel did confirm that there was no problem in the bow's release and aim, but he didn't have a chance to test its maximum range of fire. Still, just look at that clean hole in front of him. For all his experience with archery, Abel has never heard of an arrow that could still fly straight after 50 meters. Anyways, one thing was for sure, though. No matter how bizarre his compound bow was, it was the most technologically advanced in this world. Chapter 35, First Shot. Upon hearing the urgent noises of the bell, Abel readied himself whilst picking up his compound bow and quiver. Then, he ran his way to the castle's front gate. When he was just about to pass through the town square, everyone seemed panicked to see him. None one knew what was going on. Having climbed a ladder on the side of the retaining wall, the first thing that Abel saw was the sight of the Knight of Martial in his full set of armor. He was standing right on the edge of the castle with about 20 of his own guards standing beside him. All of them were holding a long spear in their hands. The Knight of Martial got worried when he noticed that Abel was here. "What are you up here, Abel? Go back inside the castle. It's dangerous around here." Without listening to the words of his adoptive father, Abel probed his head out of the retaining wall. He wasn't able to get a good view, though. An arrow was just shot at him the moment he drew his head out. Luckily for him, he was quick enough to dodge with his head and managed to shot the thing down with his own bow. As fast as that was, Abel did see about 20 orcs outside the wall. Some of them were riding on top of wolves while others were using Inferno Bovine as their stead. "Why are the orcs here?" Abel asked in surprise. "There are 2 or 3 squads of them here. That's how many of them they need to take down a fort," the Knight of Martial replied, then said with a sneer, "Not this one, though. Not with that. Where are our own archers?" Abel asked in frustration. He was just being fired at a few seconds ago. "Are we just going to let them stay there?" "There are only 5 archers in the castle," the Knight of Martial pointed towards a bunch of injured soldiers over the distance. 2 of them were already injured. "The rest, they are no match for their wolf-riding opponents. I have ordered them not to fight back." As undesirable as that sounded, the Knight of Martial continued to mock the invaders. "These imbeciles have picked the wrong place to attack. They are no match for the walls that hold us here." "Wait, is that a bow in your hand?" Realizing that there was a bow in Abel's hand, the Knight of Martial began to have a puzzled look on his face. "Yeah," Abel said smugly, "this thing has pretty nice firepower to it." To be honest, Abel wanted to talk so much more about his compound bow. He wanted to show off about how he had invented a quick, easy-to-use and long-range weapon in this backward timeline. However, since he couldn't explain it within anyone, he decided to stop after one sentence. With a quick skim of his eyes, the Knight of Martial quickly understood the mechanism behind this compound bow. He took an arrow out of Abel's quiver, placed it on the nock of his bow, and started laughing when he saw the shape of the release aid that Abel had just made. "It's a good design that you've made," the Knight of Martial commented. "Instead of using just your fingers, you use this so you can use your entire arm strength." He then said after seeing the small lever on the release aid, "No wonder they call you a master blacksmith. With this little thing here, you can shoot an arrow very easily without hurting your fingers." Archers were one of the most difficult soldiers to train because they had to rest after they've practiced for about 30 to 40 shots. Besides, the fingers were the most delicate parts of a human's body. If a bowman injured his fingers, he could no longer use a bow and arrows for the remainder of his life. Even without these said reasons, it was already pretty hard to find someone with the right talent. This was why, despite the fact that there were so many guards within Harry Castle, only a handful got to learn how to shoot arrows. The Knight of Martial began to use the release aid on the bow. Once he pulled on the string, a white aura flashed out of his body before the arrow was released. To his surprise, he couldn't pull the bow's string completely but was only able to hold it for a while after stretching it a little. This was a very tight bow. After using about 80% of his strength, the Knight of Martial had almost immediately failed to hold the bow in its place. If he didn't release his combat chi on time, he would have lost so much face in front of Abel. The Knight of Bennett would have laughed so hard if he learned how hard it was for an intermediate knight to even pull a bow. Strangely enough, once you've pulled the string and hold it there for a while, it was not very hard to keep it in place. The Knight of Martial widened his eyes when he took notice of this. "What is up with this bow, Abel?" he asked without even having an idea of what the question should be. As far as he could tell, this piece that Abel made was nothing like any bow he had seen before. Actually, screw it. With so many living targets outside the fort, he might as well just test the bow's effectiveness right away. The Knight of Martial quickly stood up. Having locked his arrow to a wolf rider, he quickly released it from his hands. It didn't hit, however. Instead, it very quickly flew over the wolf rider's head. The orcs saw the shot, too. Just when they were about to dodge it, the arrow had already went past them and flew further beyond. Harg harg. The orcs laughed as they pointed their fingers at the Knight of Martial. Then, one of the Taurens threw an axe at him. Unbothered by ridiculing noises of his enemy, the Knight of Martial caught it with his bare hand. The martial knight asked as he threw the axe to the ground, "What can't I shoot with this bow, Abel?" Abel pointed towards the marking on the bow. "That's because I've just made it, uncle. The only testing that I've done with it was at a 50-meter shooting range. If you are firing from here, you'd have to shoot the arrow in a straight line." That was all that the Knight of Martial had to hear. During his past experience with archery, he'd always have to point directly above the target that he aimed to shoot. In other words, he had to shoot in curved lines. Now, he had to use a different technique because of the firepower he was given. The Knight of Martial pulled the bow again. This time, it was aimed at the Tauren that was laughing the most. On click of the bow, and its skull was crushed the moment the Knight of Martial had released his finger. It didn't stop there, though. After punching a hole with the size of a fist, the arrow went through the Tauren's head and was plunged into the heart of a wolf rider. The orcs got pretty panicked after that. They would never expect an archer to hit a double kill. No, not right after a complete miss. Arrow. Martial Knight reached his hand out to Abel, to which Abel responded as he quickly took an arrow out of the quiver. Having reloaded himself up, the Knight of Martial began to look for a new target. The distance between the orcs and the wall was about 50 to 60 meters. With that in mind, a shot was guaranteed as long as the bow was directly aligned to its target. The Knight of Martial pressed the trigger again. This time, it was an orc that had fallen to the ground. Without doing much talking, Abel passed another arrow into the Knight of Martial's hand. 3 shots were fired after that, and 6 of the orcs were down on the ground. The surviving ones saw this and retreated as fast as they could. The Knight of Martial wasn't sparing them, though. Unlike the orcs, the Taurens remained on the battlefront. It wasn't because they were braver. If anything, it was because their steeds were much slower than that of the wolf riders. Having readied his arrow, the Knight of Martial aimed the bow towards the Tauren who was the last one in line. As relatively slow as its steed was, it still ran a 10-meter distance within a short amount of time. With that in mind, there were about 70 meters between it and the Knight of Martial. Without thinking too long on it, the Knight of Martial aimed his bow horizontally to his target. If he held the bow slightly lower than it should be, he could still hit the steed even if he missed. Without something to ride, there was no way a Tauren could have ran out of his range. It was headshot from 70 meters away. It was clean shot towards the Tauren, and the poor thing fell to the ground on the spot. Another one from 80 meters away. It was another Tauren. It got down, too, after the trigger was pulled. 90 meters away. Another one down. 100 meters. No problem. Another down. The last Tauren was about 110 meters away from the Knight of Martial. Once again, he released the arrow and succeeded to hit his target. It was in the neck, though, which was a tad off from being the perfect shot. It was now the time to use the sight on the bow. All the Taurens were pretty much gotten rid of. Even the slowest wolf rider was about 150 meters away from the Knight of Martial. Unfortunately for that one, though, the Knight of Martial could still hit a headshot whilst using the sight on the bow. In fact, the hit was so impactful that the wolf rider was thrown off after that hit. Realizing how frightening the archer that was the Knight of Martial was, the wolf riders quickly covered their heads with their bare hands. The wolves they were riding on the hand, covered their master with their whole body. As the threat of death was imminent upon them, the beasts decided to shield their masters as a means of displaying their loyalty. The Knight of Martial decided to stop after that. For a knight such as him, eliminating the enemy's stead was not something that should be done when the victory was already taken. For now, he was more than satisfied with the result of this battle. Chapter 36, Stealing Under Broad Daylight. Looking at the bow and arrow in his hands, the Knight of Martial would never imagined in a million years that the castle's crisis could be solved by only shooting some arrows. He wondered, could this be the true power of a blacksmith master? As Abel looked at the martial knight, deeply drawn by the composite bow, his facial expression became very familiar to Abel's. It was the same expression when the knight was looking at his beloved armor. Abel hoped that the Knight of Martial would return the composite bow to him. After a while, Abel reached out his hand. He wanted to take the bow back from the martial knight. However, the composite bow remained glued to the Knight of Martial's hand. Even when Abel had pulled on it a few times, it did not budge a single bit. Abel? Your uncle's been good to you this whole time, hasn't he? The smile on the Knight of Martial's face reminded Abel of the wolf's expression in Little Red Riding Hood. It sent shivers to Abel down to his spine. Abel lowered his head and said, Uncle Martial is very good to me. Your Uncle Martial has never had a good bow. You know, as an intermediate knight, I was always embarrassed to take my ugly bows out on the streets, until now. The Knight of Martial said pitifully. Abel rolled his eyes. Every time the Knight of Martial went outside, he would wear the most expensive clothes, carry a magical sword and put on the shiniest armor. Even the horses were stronger than the average war horses. Therefore, why would he carry ordinary bows and arrows around? In the able understanding of the Knight of Martial, equipment were the most important things to him. Unless it was necessary for combat, he would not carry any ordinary equipment with him. The Knight of Martial knew that this bow might be very difficult to make. However, how could he return something he had already revived? That was not his style. Today's military service had been overachieved. 12 orcs were killed outside the castle, but these were not just ordinary orcs. If they were just ordinary orcs, the Knight of Martial would not have hidden inside his own castle and not dared to fight. These orcs were at least level 6, and every single one of them knew how to fight with combat chi. The Knight of Martial was only an intermediate knight. He could defeat these orcs if they were having a one-to-one battle. However, the orcs were often more powerful than the human of the same level. This was because of their stronger build and years of battle experience. It made them machines for war. The Knight of Martial did not remember when was the last time he had felt this thrilled. He stood on the defense wall, shooting an arrow for each orc. This bow was like a messenger of death, killing anything that got in the way. Seeing the 40-year-old martial knight trying to act cute in front of him, Abel felt defeated. He hopelessly glanced in sorrow at the composite bow in the hands of the Knight of Martial. He felt this 400-pound super composite bow drifting further and further away from him. At last, Abel waved his hand and said, Uncle Martial, since you like it so much, you can take it. Martial Knight let out a huge laugh. He pulled on the bow and made an archery stand. He then proudly looked at Abel and said, only the most powerful knight can use a godly bow like this. Uncle Martial, if you pull on the bow too hard without an arrow, it can badly damage the bow, and I don't have any spare parts to repair it for you. Abel ignored the martial knights pretending to be cool, and ruthlessly pointed out the main weakness of the bow. The Knight of Martial stopped laughing. He carefully retracted his force and slowly began to restore the bowstring into its original position. However, there were also some obvious differences between this bow and any ordinary bows. When a person pulls on the bow, it requires their full force. However, once the bowstring retracts, the more force it requires. A white light of combat chi appeared from the Knight of Martial's body as he was restoring the bow. Finally the bowstring flattened. The Knight of Martial wiped the cold sweat off his forehead, and anxiously observed the bow. He had only just received this godly bow, so pretending to be cool was definitely not worth the risk of damaging it. Abel sighed. He depressingly left the guarding wall. He would now need to go back to the blacksmith guild to make a second composite bow. He need to make 2 new ones in total, one for himself, and one for his father, the Knight of Bennett. Abel understood very well that, since he gave the composite bow to the Knight of Martial, it would not take long until he show it off in front of the Knight of Bennett. Therefore, if he didn't also make one for the Knight of Bennett, he would have felt very sorry. Although his father, the Knight of Bennett, would not say anything to him, Abel knew deep down, his father would feel very sad. Open the gate of the castle. Drag the dead bodies back, and also don't forget the mounts, the Knight of Martial shouted at the cavalries waiting inside the castle gates. After the gate of the castle was opened, 10 of the cavalry rushed out. There were 2 grieving mount wolves remaining in the battlefield. When they saw the human appearing, they immediately rushed forward and prepared for their last fight. However, the 2 mount wolves only got the chance to take a few steps, before arrows pierced their skull from the guarding wall. The cavalries looked at their leader, the Knight of Martial in shiny armor, with adoration. Their leader signified the safety of the estate and their families. Other than the 2 mount wolves that were shot, there were also 4 inferno bovine outside the castle. All the other surviving mounts had ran along with the orcs. However, the inferno bovines were often not very smart and not that loyal either. Therefore, since inferno bovines were often worth quite a lot of money, they could be sold in the market after domestication. After the cavalries dragged the dead bodies, and the 4 inferno bovine back to the castle, the Knight of Martial had already decided the fate of these bovines. He would convert his horse carriages into bovine carriages. He would keep 2 for himself, and the other 2 for Abel. This way, the Knight of Martial could feel less guilty for taking his adopted son's weapon. However, the Knight of Martial actually didn't felt that guilty for taking Abel's bow. He knew if Abel could make a bow of this kind, he could make a second one. Also, the Knight of Martial thought that, if didn't take the bow from Abel, maybe Abel would not have the motivation to make another bow again. The crisis had been resolved. There shouldn't be any more orcs who would dare to seek death at Harry Castle. Therefore, the Knight of Martial ordered the guards to patrol while he could have some rest. These days, the Knight of Martial had been very stressed, and he had never taken off his armor. He had to be the leader of the castle. If the orcs had appeared near a castle, the nobles of that castle could no longer leave their castles. This was a rule of war established for all mankind. If a common enemy of human had appeared in a noble's estate and the noble left his estate, it would signify that he had given up his estate. This rule did not include the conflicts between humans. If 2 humans were battling against each other, and if one party knew that they couldn't win, surrender was always approved. Furthermore, because of the noble prisoner of war rule, no one would really want to take such a risk and pick a fight with a noble, unless they really possessed a deep hatred towards them. After returning to the blacksmith guild, Abel began his repetitive work again. He was making another 2 composite bows. He gathered the last 4 heavy bows in the warehouse, but since the Knight of Martial knew what Abel was doing, he did not become dissatisfied. This time, Abel had made a lot more than last time. He made 4 bearings, and even made a few extra the large springs in preparation for upgrading his carriage. Abel was traumatized every time he rode on a carriage. He was too accustomed to the smoothness cars in his previous life, while the carriage of this world felt like it was dancing on rocks every time it moved. In the next 2 days, Abel spent all his energy on making the composite bows. Since he had gained the experience from his last attempt, the 2 composite bows he made this time had been further refined. Because the orcs were now all driven away, Abel decided to go outside to test out the range of his new bows. Abel perfected the scale of the sighting device. It was divided into 100 meters, 100 to 200 meters, 200 meters to 400 meters. Abel realized when shooting beyond 400 meters, the power of the arrow would be greatly reduced. So Abel estimated that the maximum range of these composite bow was within 400 meters. Any range beyond that would be impossible to kill anything, at most it could only badly injure the enemy. Furthermore, the speed of the arrow would also be greatly reduced after 400 meters. Therefore, the enemy could easily avoid it. Upon completing the 2 composite bows, Abel was eager to send the bow to his father. Therefore, he had proposed to the Knight of Marshall to visit Bennet Castle. Chapter 37, Giving out bows as presents. Are you heading towards Bennet's castle now? I really don't suggest going because it's extremely dangerous out there right now. The Knight of Marshall was hesitant to let Abel venture off during the current situation since he would be vulnerable to the attacking orcs outside. Even if Abel had brought a few guards with him, it still probably wasn't going to end well if they were forced into a fight. The orcs that had appeared were all above level 6. The guards were no match against these orcs, and if they were to fight, they probably couldn't even fend off a single orc. Uncle Marshall, I have to get to the Bennet Castle. You saw the power of my bow. I need to deliver the newly forged bows to the Bennet Castle. Otherwise, my family wouldn't stand a chance against those orcs, Abel explained, trying to persuade Knight of Marshall to let him venture off to the Bennet Castle. Why are you willing to risk your life to give them the bow, when they didn't even ask for it? You know, I had to ask you before you would even give it to me, the Knight of Marshall said with a hint of bitterness and jealousy on his face. After hearing what the Knight Marshall said, Abel immediately spoke in an extremely serious manner. Well, this attack made me doubt the safety of the Bennet Castle. Just look at the power of these orcs. I must go and deliver the bow to them before it's too late. Alright, if you insist to head towards the Bennet Castle, I'll go with you. The Knight of Marshall felt that he had no choice. He grudgingly decided that he would head out to the Bennet Castle with Abel. For him, however, he was more concerned about Abel's safety than the safety of the castle. Since the castle had already killed off at least half of the attacking orcs, he was certain that the orcs wouldn't dare to come back and attack the castle unless if they wanted to commit suicide. Uncle Marshall. Are you sure you can come with me? Abel knew that it would have been extremely difficult for his uncle to leave the castle with the current situation. Even though Bennet's castle wasn't too far away from them. If the Knight of Marshall was found wandering out with Abel, he would have lost all his estate because he went AWOL, absent without official leave. Besides that matter, the castle also needed the leadership and commands from Knight of Marshall to effectively defend against any attacking orcs. Don't worry about it, Abel. It's fine. I will go to Bennet's castle with you. Just let me change into some different clothes so that people can't recognize me that easily. If we take the horses and ride as fast as we can, we should be able to return within half a day. The Knight of Marshall knew exactly what Abel was worried about, but to him, if he had lost his estate to someone else, he could always get it back in the future. If he lost Abel, however, he would have never been able to get someone's life back. The Knight of Marshall knew that, as long as he stayed with Abel and educate him well, their potential together would be limitless. They might even gain a bigger territory and a higher title than what they have now. It was already afternoon by the time they finished arguing. Shortly after, Abel equipped a leather armor suit and got onto a warhorse. For Knight Marshall, he wrapped his silky gold hair and swapped his eye-catching helmet into a less flashy one. Moreover, he also wore a hat that was capable of covering his face and took an ordinary warhorse so that no one would have noticed him during their trip to the Bennet Castle. Before the two began their journey, both warhorses were fed with oats, which helped maintain them within their peak performance as well as maximize their powers. Without notifying anyone, Abel and Knight Marshall quietly sneaked out of the castle, when everyone inside the castle was celebrating in their successful attempt in defending against the orcs. Without taking any detours, the two horses galloped towards Bennet Castle in a straight line. By this time, there were no visible signs of life anywhere in the Lord's land between the Bennett Castle and Harry's Castle. This was because, during a battle, all civilians that were resided in these lands would have evacuated and gathered inside the castle for safety measures. This would have explained why Abel and Knight Marshall had not stumbled across anyone during their trip to the Bennett Castle. After 2 hours of traveling, Bennett's castle was finally visible within their eyesight. Abel could not help but feel a sense of relief as he took in a deep breath. In the distance, Bennett's castle stood firmly and quietly in the setting sun. The castle's entrance was shut tightly, and the guards of the castle were vaguely visible on the outskirt of the castle walls. Everything looked to be perfectly fine, and the Bennett Castle seemed to be unharmed. It didn't seem to be attacked by orcs. As Abel and Marshall approached closer and closer towards the castle, their arrival caused the emergency bell of the castle to ring rapidly. As they got closer to the entrance of the castle, they were met immediately with soldiers equipped with bows aiming down at them from the castle walls. "It's me, Abel. Open the door," Abel shouted. "Holster your weapon, guards, it's Master Abel," someone yelled loudly. "Open the door." Suddenly, there were deep voices of Knight of Bennett coming from somewhere. Shortly after, the door of the Bennett Castle was slowly opened. When Abel and the Knight of Marshall entered the castle, the door was quickly closed for security to prevent any potential of attacks. "Abel, how dare you come to the castle during these dangerous times?" the Knight of Bennett said reproachfully towards Abel in a rather serious tone. "Father, I need to talk to you privately. Can we find a quiet place to talk? It's an urgent matter," Abel said quietly, as he glanced over towards the Knight of Marshall, who took cover closely with Abel as he tried to prevent anyone from spotting him. For Abel to travel across to the Bennett Castle during these dangerous times, the Knight of Bennett certainly knew that there must have been something important. Else, Abel wouldn't have taken such a big risk to get here. The Knight of Bennett pitched a suspicious look at the mysterious Knight Marshall, that was next to Abel. But without hesitation, he led the Abel and the mysterious Knight into the guest room. He then told the guards to not disturb them as he closed the door once Abel and Marshall went inside. "Father, this is..." Abel was about to reveal the identity of the mysterious Knight. The Knight of Bennett recognized the Knight of Marshall at first glance. He then immediately spoke up and said, "Marshall, have you gone out of your mind? You're leaving your territory during these dangerous times. You better have a valid reason for coming along with Abel." "Hey! Do you think I want to come here? Your silly boy said he had to come here. I couldn't just let him come here by himself. I had to follow him. Otherwise, he would have for sure ended up dead." Knight Marshall took off his hat, wobbled off his suppressed golden hair that was wrapped throughout the entire trip as he replied back to the Knight of Bennett in a rather angry attitude. "God damn it, Marshall, you always cried when things went wrong." The Knight of Bennett helplessly shook his head while looking at Marshall. He then turned around and asked Abel, "What's the matter? Why do you have to act so mysteriously all the time? Did you think about the consequences if Marshall was caught leaving his territory? If he was caught, it would have been extremely inconvenient and troublesome for all parties involved." "Father, I knew the consequences, but I've come all the way here from Harry's castle was to give you this." Abel took out a composite bow and passed it over to his father. Knight Bennett took the composite bow with his hands and started to fiddle with the bow. Promptly after, he asked Abel with a surprised tone, "You came all the way here just to give me this? What do you mean, this, Bennett?" "This is the Harry's bow, a name that I've made for this special bow," Knight Marshall said with a sense of dissatisfaction since he was very upset with Bennett's attitude and his lack of appreciation for the special bow. Abel could not help but remain silent and covered his head. He knew that Marshall declared the name of the bow without consulting or even bothering to tell him. What's worse was that he even took his own name to classify the bow. Even though Abel had the same surname as the Knight of Marshall, he was certain that his uncle's intention of naming the bow Harry's bow was because he wanted it after his own name. "Bennett, It's not just an ordinary bow like you think it is. Here, try shooting an arrow and see for yourself. The Knight of Marshall then enthusiastically took out an arrow and handed it to the Knight of Bennett. As he enthusiastically instructed Knight Bennett on how to aim and how to operate the spreader, "Okay Bennett, let's shoot at the wall over there," as Knight Marshall pointed towards the wall. The guest room was massive, it was nearly a 40-square-meter room. The wall that Marshall told Bennett to shoot towards was more than 20 meters in distance, and without saying anything, Bennett released his hand and the arrow immediately disappeared on the bow. Within a split second, there was a harsh shrill sound, and when they looked towards at the wall, the arrow had already pierced through the wall that was made from boulders. Knight Bennett looked at the arrows on the wall, shocked and astonished of the power of the bow. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He quickly walked over to the wall and knocked the wall a few times with his bare hands, confirming the bow's legitimacy. He was stunned so that he didn't even realize that the wall that he had just broken was his own guest room. He then pulled out the arrow from the wall using a substantial amount of force. As he glanced at the wall, the arrow had made a hole that was 2 points per meters deep. When he looked over to the arrowhead's shape had already deformed due to the incredible strength of the impact and the arrow strikes through the wall. "This bow." Knight Bennett looked at Abel as he said in complete astonishment and curiosity in how his son has acquired such a powerful weapon. As Abel was about to speak, the Knight of Marshall interrupted the conversation between the two and said, "Abel became a master blacksmith recently, did you know that?" Then he was silent. When Knight of Bennett heard that his son had become a master blacksmith, he regretted giving Abel to Marshall as an adopted son. When Marshall repeated once again that his adopted son had become a master blacksmith, the facial expression on Bennett's face immediately filled with sorrow. Marshall was not able to understand Bennett's expression, so he continued speaking. "Abel designed Harry's bow for me so that I could withstand the orcs. Just today, I used the Harry bow to swiftly take down 12 orcs. All of them were level 6 and above too." Knight Bennett felt a sense of uncontrollable shock and amazement as he gazed at Harry's bow that was on his hand. He now began to understand the reason why Abel had taken such a big risk to bring Harry's bow all the way from Harry's castle. In terms of what Marshall had said to him, knowing him for so long already, if half the things that he said were true, it was already good enough. However, what his old friend Marshall had done for Abel was beyond anyone's capability. Marshall risked his territory just for the sake of Abel's safety. Bennett knew that it would have been extremely difficult for him to make such a decision and to risk it all. The Knight of Bennett drew the bow once again. This time, he had discovered the advantages of the bow. The bow was hard to pull, but it was easy to aim at, and also it had a terrifying amount of power and destruction. Knight Marshall then looked directly at Bennett with a sense of mockery, and said with a smile, "I forgot to tell you smarty pants, Harry's bow cannot be used without any ammunition." By the time that the Knight of Bennett had restored his bow, using a large amount of his combat chi, Knight Marshall was already laughing so hard, as if he had already forgotten that he had also made the same mistake before. Abel and the Knight Marshall did not stay long in Bennett's castle, and after instructing Knight Bennett on how to operate Harry's bow, the two quickly set off to go back to Harry's castle before anyone realized that they were missing. When they departed Bennett's castle, it was already dark. However, the two individuals were so familiar with the road, especially with Marshall who had journeyed on this route countless times. Alongside with guidance of the moonlight in the night sky, the warhorses were also quite fast as they traveled back to their castle. Chapter 38, Matthew Castle. As Abel and the Knight of Marshall were traveling back towards Harry's castle, Abel suddenly noticed a fire from a distance. Abel immediately informed the Knight of Marshall, "Look, Uncle Marshall, there is a fire there." The Knight Marshall glimpsed over towards the direction of where the fire was and said, "That's the direction of Lord Matthew's castle." Lord Matthew's fiefdom was sat within the middle of the Knight estate between Knight Marshall and Knight Bennett. The relationship between Knight Marshall and Lord Matthew wasn't too great. This was because Lord Matthew did not acknowledge knights as a noble position. Although in most parts of the world where humans lived, the knights were considered as nobles. However, in some rare parts of the world, some people did not consider them as nobles. Lord Matthew was one of them. Although Lord Matthew and Knight Marshal were neighbors, the relationship between them was pretty much limited to ceremonial meeting and saluting. Now that the Knight Marshal acknowledged the fire was originating from Lord Matthew's castle, he began to hesitate whether he should try to help them or not. There were a lot of reasons that caused Marshal to hesitate in assisting Lord Matthew's castle. Firstly, he could not expose his own identity. If he was caught and found to have left his territory, he would have been in big trouble. Secondly, he had to protect Abel. This meant that he was not assured that he could save Matthew's castle, as he had to stay alongside with Abel to guarantee his safety. Abel remained silent. He gazed directly at Knight Marshal and thought to himself. He was going to let the Knight of Marshal decide this himself. Abel had never met Lord Matthew before. He had never heard his name being mentioned by someone else. Frankly, he didn't know what kind of person he was, and he didn't even know what he looked like. To Abel, he wasn't going to risk his life to assist a castle that he had never heard about before. Unless he was guaranteed that he was completely safe, then he would have gone and helped them. However, Knight Marshal decided to assist Lord Matthew's castle. We will go and help them, but you must stay with me at all times. I cannot expose my identity in there, that's why you must step in and use your status as a master blacksmith. As Knight Marshal carefully instructed Abel with a serious tone. Abel quickly obeyed Knight Marshal's order and said, "Okay, Uncle Marshal. I will do as you say." Abel then took Harry's bow out of his horse saddle. Although he struggled with using Harry's bow due to its tough laborious efforts, shooting only around 3 to 4 shots should have been fine for him. At the same time, Knight Marshal was holding his very own Harry's bow. As he placed an arrow onto his bow and was about to draw the bowstring, he quickly discovered another superior advantage of Harry's bow. The bow was especially suitable and advantageous when riding on a horse. When using a regular bow, one must use both legs, each on one side of the body to properly control the horse. Then, the majority of energy and strength was needed to continuously pull the bow, while all at the same time trying to aim and shoot. However, Harry's bow was capable of holding the arrow with very little effort. By doing so, it allowed the operator to allocate more power to control their horse as well as being able to have sufficient time to aim and shoot at their target without ease. The two warhorses that Abel and Marshal rode were very agile. As the two approached closer and closer towards the castle, Abel was the first to notice that the castle was in complete chaos. He saw that 4 wolf troopers were attacking the people who are trying to escape. When the 4 wolf rider heard the sound of hooves from the horses, they immediately shouted very loudly, and 2 of the wolf rider equipped with long knives instantly began charging directly towards Abel and Knight of Marshal. "Watch out! There's one right in front of you, and there's also one behind me," Knight of Marshal said. Abel aimed with care and precision at one of the wolf troopers that were charging directly towards him and immediately pulled the trigger. The bow was so powerful that it instantly shot through the wolf trooper's brain and created a hole. Shortly after, the second wolf trooper was promptly shot down by Knight of Marshal. The 2 wolf troopers who were still chasing the people down realized that their allied troops were shot down by Abel and Marshal. They then started to howl extremely loudly. Abel knew exactly what they were doing as he understood the orc language. The wolf troopers were summoning their allies inside the castle to come out and prepare for battle against Abel and Knight Marshal. Abel and the Knight of Marshal continued with their killing spree, as the 2 quickly killed the other 2 wolf troopers that were hunting down the people who were trying to escape. The wolf troopers did not stop charging towards Abel and Knight Marshal when they saw their allies being shot down. Instead, they charged furiously and madly towards them. The Knight of Marshal calmly shot down another 4 worgens. He then turned around to look back at Abel and said, "See, that's the nature and personalities of these worgens. They are very loyal." Abel nodded his head and promptly replied, "All right, Uncle Marshal. Thanks for letting me know." as he glanced over towards the 4 worgans that had been shot by Knight Marshal. For Abel, he wasn't shooting at the wolf troopers and the worgans since he felt a sense of resentment but also couldn't bear the cruelty of killing these orcs. However, he held his trust in Uncle Marshall and believed that he would take care of them. Suddenly, 6 wolf riders were rushing out of the Matthew castle who were all hanging large packages on them. When Knight Marshall saw the 6 wolf riders coming out from the castle, a light flashed in his eyes and he hummed, "You're all dead." These wolf riders who were charging towards Abel and Marshall were still carrying the valuables from the castle, and their greed ultimately led to a much quicker death since they were much slower. Abel's and Marshall's knights had both shot their arrows towards their enemies, and the last arrows that had been shot were around 30 meters away from them. The 6 wolf troopers were all killed while they were charging towards them, including their worgans. As Knight Marshall watched the wolf riders, who have died on the way from charging towards them, he sighed and said, "This was a party of 10. These orcs are very strong, but they lack the protection of armor." He then glanced back at Abel and explained, the blacksmith union had strictly forbidden anyone from the blacksmith union to forge armor for these orcs. Moreover, the orcs themselves had no skills or experiences in forging armor, so the only option they had was to use their bodies to block our arrows. The frightened crowd from Matthew's castle slowly discovered that all wolf troopers who were attacking them had been killed. As the crowd slowly gathered together, a middle-aged man who wore a suit approached Abel and Knight Marshall. Knight Marshall acted as if he was only assisting Abel as he stood behind him so that Abel would have looked like the person who had killed most of the orcs and he would have just been an assistant for him. "Hello, Sir Knight, thank you for saving our lives. My name is Ken, Matthew's butler." Although he looked frightened while he spoke, the deep etiquette that Ken possessed made him appear extremely polite and full of courtesy. He then gave Abel a grateful salute. "I'm Abel Harry and I accept your gratitude. May I ask where your master is?" Abel was very displeased and disappointed that Lord Matthew did not appear to thank them for their effort after their rescue. He and the Knight of Marshall risked their lives to assist Lord Matthew, but Lord Matthew did not even appear. Such a response seemed rude and puzzling to them. "Master Abel, my master has." When the butler heard Abel's question, he was already too shocked and tearful to even speak. The manner and courtesy Ken had displayed was suddenly gone, which was extremely peculiar for a noble-classed butler. Abel's name was spread so quickly throughout Harvest City that even the nobles knew that there was a young master blacksmith who lived in the area around Harvest City. When Abel heard the butler answering his question with tears, he already knew that something has happened to Lord Matthew. Abel then got off his horse and supported the butler with his hand to prevent him from falling. Currently, Abel's appearance was far beyond his age. He was 13 years old with a height that was nearly 1.7 meters tall. As Abel had just saved the nobility of Matthew's castle, he was able to temporarily act as the director to issue orders and various commands. This was one of the noble regulations. It applied when there was no noble to command a castle, and if the castle was rescued by other noble. "Alright, I'll need you to arrange men for law and order to be kept within the castle. Lord Matthew's message will be sent to the Lord of Harvest City. The Lord there will decide what happens after that." Abel said directly to Ken. "As you will." The butler Ken held back his tears while Abel decided to keep Matthew's castle safe and stable from the evil and theft. Abel's command also meant that there wouldn't be anyone robbing, murdering and stealing from the castle during these terrible times. Abel did not stay for too long. Within an hour or so, Matthew's castle was all quiet and peaceful again. The orcs' bodies were all piled up in the public square in the middle of the castle. The bodies of family members of the Matthew family were placed in the hall, and the other civilians that had deceased were placed in the side chambers. Everything within the storeroom was added with an additional iron lock to ensure that it was well protected and safe. Abel appointed the butler and 5 intact bodyguards to securely protect Matthew's family valuables and belongings until the owner of the property come forward and deal with the situation here. All the members within the Matthew family were killed during the orcs' attack. As the orcs rushed into the castle, they always looked for the most valuable and gorgeous room to rob and kill. The Matthew family was the owner of the castle, so it meant that they were the first noble victims of the attack. All of them were massacred. Since everything has been arranged by Abel, he had asked Ken to depart from the castle. Although Ken wanted Abel to stay until a new ruler was sent by the capital city, he didn't dare to oppose or criticize Abel's decision to leave, since Abel was a master as well as a noble too. As Abel departed Matthew's castle, Abel and Knight Marshall looked directly at each other in the eyes. The event that occurred here today made both of them very emotional. A long-continued generation of the Matthew family was all gone in one attack. If something like this happened to the Knight of Bennett or Knight of Marshall, Abel didn't even want to think about or imagine the consequences of that. From this event, he was now more acutely aware of the true cruelty of this world. The figure of Abel and Marshall Knight gradually was slowly disappearing into the night as they rode back towards the hairy castle. Ken, the butler, watched Abel's back from a distance and his heart was filled with gratitude for Abel and Marshall's assistance and rescue during these current circumstances and conditions. Abel thought to himself, these were the true and real knights that the world needs. This marks the end of part 7 of the story, Abe the Wizard. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.